thrusting spears that you could throw at a push if you needed to, specialised throwing spears, so types of javelin, and one type of those that seems to possibly survive into the Viking Age is the so-called angon. Now the angon, I don't have an angon, but what I do have here is a Roman pilum, and the Roman pilum is sort of the ancestor of the angon. So the angon has a long thin shaft that is designed, as I have demonstrated in numerous videos, to pass through a shield and hit the person behind. So even if you were holding this shield out at length out here, as you see the missile, assuming you do see the missile coming in towards you, and of course most things you're hit by you don't see coming, but assuming you see someone lob an angon at you and you put your shield up here to protect, there is a chance that that shaft will come through the shield and hit you behind anyway. So a very effective weapon, and clearly specialised to throwing, not particularly good as a hand weapon, although you could use it as a hand weapon at a push. And certainly in the Roman era we do have at least one written example of pilums being used, or pilae rather, being used as hand weapons as well as throwing weapons. And then lastly, there's this hewing spear. So what's a hewing spear? Well, those of you regular viewers to my channel will know that one lives behind me, leaning up against my door here. And this is essentially what hewing spears at the time were like. Now, these weren't specifically Viking weapons. These were a type of spear that probably originated in Frankish, in the Frankish Empire, in my opinion. As far as I'm aware, the earliest examples that I have seen of these have actually been from the Frankish Empire, or the Frankish kingdoms. So maybe even Merovingian, but this is a type of spear that is clearly quite different from the normal stabbing spear. The simple fact with spears is that the bigger you make the head, sometimes the worse they function as a spear, if it's a conventional thrusting spear. So everyone thinks, oh, a nice big long spearhead looks great, but once you start to use it, you find actually having a light, quick spearhead that makes exactly the same hole at the stabbing end is actually better if it's lighter. You can handle the spear more quickly, you can handle it for longer. Doesn't matter how strong you are, however strong you are, you will be able to use that spear more effectively and for longer if it's lighter. But if you're gonna add extra mass onto a spear, you really want to have a good payback, okay? For all of that added mass and therefore making the pole weapon slower, what are you going to get back? Well, what you get with this kind of weapon is firstly something that can't be chopped off near the head, okay, because you've got more metal, so it's more difficult for someone who's waving a sword near you to lop off the head of your, or damage the shaft of your spear because the shaft is further away from them. But also, you've got these lugs. Now, these lugs are very, very important for a number of things. I've talked about these in previous videos, but I think the two most important purposes for these lugs are, number one, defense, and number two, offense. Now that seems simplistic, but it's basically true. For defense, if someone, for example, swings a sword at you, at your head, it means that if you're deflecting aside that blow, if it slides down the shaft, it will get stuck on that, much like the crossguard on a sword. But additionally, if someone's thrusting a spear at you like this, as we see with the later 16th and 17th century treatises which talk about pole arms, for the partisan, these can actually be used to push aside the incoming thrust. So if someone else has got a spear and is thrusting it at you, you can actually use these lugs to control and deflect their thrust. So that's the kind of defense. In terms of offense, you might think, well, what are you going to do with that offensively? Aha! That's when these come in. If the opponent has a shield, you now have the ability to hook, okay? So really, really useful. If you're using a stabbing weapon against someone with a shield, getting past that shield is somewhat problematic. But if you miss or they deflect your thrust and you can get over the edge of their shield and pull it, you can now come in with another thrust somewhere else. Lastly, the obvious thing to the hewing spear is that it can hew. And hew simply means cut, okay? It could be a chop, it could be a slice. And if you've got this length of edge on your weapon, you now have the ability to deliver a fairly powerful chop, pretty much like a sword chop, okay? Or if you miss your thrust, you could come back with a pull cut. You could do a draw cut to the back of the knee, the hamstring, this kind of thing. Or you can do a push cut as well. If the thrust misses, then you've got a fair amount of edge up here that you will do a push cut with as well. So, quite versatile weapons. These probably were not primarily designed to be used with shields, or possibly they were. We don't really know. If we look in Frankish manuscripts of the 10th, 11th century, then indeed we do see what seem to be winged spears, as these are sometimes called. We see winged spears used with shields, but I have to say in the Frankish manuscripts, they don't usually show a very long blade like this. So my interpretation, and feel free to comment on this below if you've got a differing one, but my interpretation is if you have a particularly long blade, then that weapon's not designed to be used with a shield. It's designed primarily to be used two-handed. Okay, so it's a bit of an exception to the normal spear rule of this period. Now we get into a weapon which is heavily associated with the Vikings and with the Viking Age, and that is the axe. And it's so much associated with Vikings, and correctly so, it has to be said, and I'll get into that in a second, that even if we look into high fantasy, you know, things like Lord of the Rings, where dwarves and the styling of dwarves in fantasy, or even Warhammer, very clearly owes a lot to the fantasy idea of Vikings, you know, the horned helmet type of fantasy Vikings. They are given axes because of that association with that kind of stylistic culture. So axes are deeply, deeply ingrained in people's imagination when they think of Vikings. Now, funnily enough, it's one of those things which is almost a fantasy trope that is drawn from history that is actually not really wrong. Now, that's not to say that the Vikings used axes, you know, like they were omnipresent. The fact is that probably spears and swords were, I won't say as common, but certainly spears were more common. Spears were probably the most common Viking weapon, but swords were still very common. It wasn't like every Viking had an axe, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. But when we compare, and this is the important bit, when we compare to other European areas and other